Hey guys, welcome to the Hub at Revolve, our disciple making training. Here we're going to unpack for you on YouTube the same disciple making content that we teach in person at our local church, Revolve, and all over the globe.
All over the world.
People. Whoa.
That's my all over the world gong.
That was very good. This is David.
Yes, I'm your host, and this is my co-host, Bill Lackey.
How you guys
William
doing?
James Lackey.
James. It's
Jonathan.
John. It's actually John. But,
Okay.
close enough.
Is
David
it John
Bruce.
or Jonathan?
It's John.
Just John?
Just John.
That's weird.
I mean, is it?
I don't know. I've never known someone named John. It's always Jonathan or you're William. No one's really named Bill. Have you ever met someone just named Bill?
I mean, your name is
Dave.
David Bruce. It's not Brucimus.
So we're starting this new podcast, and if you know anything about Bill and I, there's two things that we love.
Starting stuff and not finishing things.
No, we love making podcasts, and we love disciple making movements. And you're gonna say, what is a disciple making movement? Well, that's what we're here to talk to you about.
It is. That's definitely a big part of the stuff we're going to talk about.
Yep. So, but to get started, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a little intro just to get you. We're going to wade into the deep end here. So we're just stepping into the pool.
You ready?
What, Bill? Was your first? What?
What was yours?
Oh, I'm going first?
Yeah. What was your first truly cross-cultural experience? I'm going to let you self-define that. Maybe it was,
Okay.
whatever.
Well, I always like to answer these questions with the first thing that comes to my mind.
Uh-huh.
And I'm going to say when I was a kid, I was probably 8 years old, there was a kid on my street, and his name was Ali.
Okay. Was it Muhammad Ali?
No, it wasn't Muhammad Ali, but his name was Ali. And I just remember
Prince Ali?
I don't know. I mean, I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and he was probably 12 or 13. He was kind of a cool older kid.
Yeah, cool.
And I mean, growing up in Cape May and Lower Township,
Mm-hmm.
you don't know a lot of Alis.
No.
And I think he may have been a Coast Guard family, but it was, it was very interesting just to be in his house and it was different.
A flying carpet.
They had a flying car.
They had a magic lamp with a genie in it. Prince Ali.
That, as a cross-culture worker, you just were really painted some broad strokes, my brother.
Well, we're all on a journey.
We all are on a journey, and some of us are on a magic carpet, apparently. But I think in a true sense of really understanding cross-culture, I want to say, let's see, my first trip overseas was to England. That was definitely not cross-cultural. I mean, it was just this is just
Bangers and mash.
Yeah. But I think going to the Philippines and, I don't know. I think Indonesia is probably
The first
cultural, because I'm trying to think of living with people. I mean, that's how you get a real cross-cultural experience, because you're like, oh, I went on a cruise to Jamaica. It's that's not a cross-cultural experience. You're in a resort.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
But when you're living with people, that's the true.
But with that definition, some people never have a cross-cultural experience, even if they've done a bunch of trips or something like that. I hear that, but you know what, David? It's your answer.
Well, that person has obviously never used a restroom in someone's kitchen while a lady was cooking. I mean, that's a cross-cultural experience.
It is a cross-cultural experience, and one that David had, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it at some point in time.
At some point. Okay, so what was yours?
Well, on the most cursory
I gave you a pretty broad span. I went from Ali, who was just an Arab
kitchen
kid in my neighborhood, to doing my business in a kitchen.
So I think the first one would be.
I mean, I didn't grow up in fancy North Jersey like you. So.
I remember. Apparently, you don't know where I grew up. I grew up in Warren County. All right, Warren County.
That was the joke.
Okay, and so I think my first cross-cultural experience was we were on a class trip into New York City, and my friend Scott and I just ditched the class trip because those are the things you could do in the 90s. Like
Yeah.
just ditch your class trip and teachers
Yeah.
were too busy smoking. They didn't care.
Yep. Mhm.
You know what I mean? And we went into Chinatown and we got caught in the rain. And so we went into a Chinese laundromat to draw, and we stripped down to our boxers and our undershirts and
Okay.
put our clothes in the dryer.
Okay.
And just was chilling in there with this Chinese guy who didn't speak any English, and all he had was a neck beard. Like his beard started here and just was like,
Yeah. Did it stop? Did it stop like at his chin?
it was just like his chin was shaved. It literally was like, it would be like if I had a completely shaved chin, but then like I let this hair grow right here.
Okay.
And it was the grossest thing I'd ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
And he just kind of sat there like eating like an onion or something like that, talking to us. And or not talking to us, just kind of looking at us. And yeah, and just like the pigs hanging in the windows and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff at Chinatown in the 90s, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I was like, where are we?
Yeah.
I don't know how we ever found our way back to our class trip, come to think of it. But then I would say the next...
Do you think that there's an old Chinese man on a podcast somewhere being like,
Crazy times in America!
yeah, I was in that one time with these two kids. They came in on no clothes. I was eating my onion. You know how I do. You know how I do.
Smoking a cigarette.
Yep.
And then I would say the first real cross-culture experience outside of the country was in Czech Republic when I was a freshman in college, and I was at this summer camp all summer. And I remember thinking this was Czech Republic in like 2000. So it was still... it wasn't fully westernized yet. And I remember we went to this mall in Brno, 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 and got pizza with one of the missionary kids who was like a teenager. And they used ketchup for the base of the pizza
Oh.
instead of tomato sauce.
That's cool.
And he's like, "It's pretty good, right?" And I was like, "It's something."
Yeah.
And but yeah, just kind of living in that camp for 8 weeks where there was, you're with kids and yeah, just eating.
I always think it's cool when you
Different
go
food and stuff.
overseas and people try to do American things for you.
Yeah.
And they're like, huh, pretty cool, huh?
Like, you want to
Right?
go shoot revolvers?
Yeah.
Ow, pow, 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 pow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember when we were in England, they one of the people that we met up with for something, they had a barbecue.
Yeah.
And they're like, look, we're cooking outside like they do in America. And they made like burgers, but they weren't that good.
Yeah, they were.
You
Yeah.
know?
Because they were
So-
made with like chicken or something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Yep.
So it was pretty funny. They had like, I don't know, it's pretty funny. But
Well,
they
then you go to like the Middle East and they're like, "You want to have a barbecue?" And you think you're going to have a barbecue.
Yeah.
And then they basically
They
just
bring out a
like,
lamb.
they dig like a pit in the ground and they like fill it with like pallet wood and set it on fire. And then there's like a guy just like squatted down turning a lamb over a spit.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, this is like a real barbecue.
Yeah, that's the real deal. So, well, that's man,
Cross-cultural experiences.
we could talk about these all day. I'm having so many
all
thoughts
season
in my
you mean.
head.
Get it? All season.
What about it?
Podcast season. For the whole Hub podcast, however long it may last. Long may it rain.
Long may it rain. All right. So
It's basically, I'm anticipating that this is going to be the #1 podcast in North Cape May.
yeah. Well, we have to compete with G's. Now G started
Oh,
a
that's right. G
podcast.
started, maybe #2. Maybe it'll be #2
Yeah.
podcast.
Yep. So Bill always says he wants to be the Joe Rogan of disciple making.
That's it.
So
That's it.
all right. Well, so let's just, so that's our intro. Bill, what do you expect? What can those who are tuning in and are listening, they're watching on YouTube, what can they expect week in and week out from the Hub at Revolve Disciple Making Movement podcast?
Also known as the Joe Rogan of Discipleship podcast experience. No, I was thinking about this. Gina and I were talking about this. Gina's my wife. We were talking about this idea because we've trained a lot of people in disciple making methodologies and principles over the years. Like it's got to be hundreds of people by now. And you think about
Dozens of people.
It's been hundreds. There's been at least 200 people, I'm thinking, at least. More than that, really. And then you think about the fact that people will tell you continually that they wish they could get a refresher, or they say they felt the most engaged with disciple making when they were going through the course because it was like built-in accountability. And so I was just thinking about that stuff and thinking if we did something like this, it would be an opportunity for people to stay fresh with those principles, the basic disciple-making principles that are found across the world, and kind of hear those refreshers and have a place where if maybe they had a disciple-making question that they wanted to submit in like our mailbag, you know what I mean?
Mailbag.
You know, like Blue's Clues.
Yep.
Hey, mailbox.
Okay. So every week we could kind of go over some principles. We can answer some questions. We can, talk about something new.
And
Maybe hear some testimonies.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and weave within that stories from our travels and the way that we've done things here in the United States, and then how those things might differ if you were in a different country. Because, David and I have traveled all over the world doing trainings and executing these principles. And the truth is that there's no one size fits all. But if you have the principle in mind instead of like a very specific manifestation of the principle, then whether you're in Germany or the United States or, Egypt or wherever it might be, you kind of have a base of operations from which to go.
Man, remember that shawarma we had in Egypt? That was really good. We went to that restaurant.
I still don't think I know what shawarma is. Like he was like, you want to get shawarma? And I was like, shawarma.
And it wasn't really it wasn't really thought it was. But I remember we had to get a police escort to get into the restaurant.
That's right.
That was pretty baller. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, just stretch your legs for a second, and we're going to get back into it. And we're going to talk about what is DMM. Is it a...
Dudes making money.
Dudes making dangerous monkey. Mice.
If you crossbreed.
We'll be right back.
Dangerous monkey mice.
We are back with DMM, which is, in all seriousness, it is disciple-making movements.
Yeah.
And so we're going to talk about that, and we're going to break it down. That's the way we like to start these things. We're going to break it down, disciple-making movements. And we're going to do it in reverse. So what's the definition of a movement?
Well,
just running around the block.
That's it. Just running around the block.
Jumping jacks.
Done. Next term.
Yeah.
No, so, disciple-making movements, maybe you guys have heard that term before. It got a little pop culture over, not really pop culture. It got a little bit more press over the last few years. I was trying to remember when. I think it might be when FAI came out with the Sheep Among Wolves documentary. It was called Sheep Among Wolves Volume 2. And kind of like Rambo, First Blood Part 2. Sheep Among Wolves Volume 2. And it was talking about the underground church in Iran. And I feel like we had already been involved in DMM for probably 8 years by the time that came out. But that really brought it to the front of conversations. And the idea of a movement is basically a rapid multiplication of disciples, groups, and churches and leaders, multiplication at every level. And people are going to define it differently, but essentially it's that if you have multiple streams, so you think of like multiple streams coming out of churches that are planting churches, groups that are starting groups, and this is happening in at least 4 different streams, and it's continuing to go down multiple generations.
Great.
And often that means exponential growth instead of linear growth because it kind of keeps expanding with multiplication.
Yep.
And so that's what a movement can look like.
So if you were to draw it on a board, you'd have a circle with 3 lines coming out of it, and then there'd be 3 circles under that, and then 3 lines coming out of that. That would be 9 circles, and then the 9 circles becomes
6 billion.
6 billion. Yep.
Just a matter of time.
So that's multiplication. And we're going to talk about a little bit more about multiplication compared to addition, because addition is kind of what we see more often, but multiplication is what we're looking for. So we have disciple-making movement. We're going to talk about today about what it means to make disciples.
So what do you think? When you hear that term, what do you think the average person in the United States, when they hear disciple making, what do you think comes to their brain?
Invite someone to church. Invite someone to a Bible study.
Yeah, I was going to say invite someone to church or evangelism. Maybe I think probably a lot of people put it as synonymous with sharing the faith. But I think one of the things that we're going to talk about,
or it's like a class you go through. It's like you've gone through this class, so you've arrived. Yeah,
I went through Experiencing God workbook, which is a good workbook, but then it's like, now I'm a disciple, and now I just need to go make a disciple out of somebody else. I think, one of the things that we want to talk about as we go through this podcast is we have these conceptions in our mind of what discipleship is like, what disciple making is like, even the impossibility of movement. And those are very much American concepts. I think because we don't see certain things here, we assume they're not going to happen anywhere because we almost like project our culture onto stuff. So I think when we hear the term make disciples, I think we mean, as Americans, we often mean make more Christians, that's part of it, but it's not make converts, it's make disciples. And so the idea being that before you can have a movement that's multiplying out, you need to have an established, process or pattern, whatever you want to say, of making disciples. And I think making disciples is more than just converting someone to Christianity. It's helping them grow into maturity so that they can lead people to Christ and they can help them grow into maturity. It's like being a parent, you know what I mean? Making a baby and then helping the baby grow up.
Okay.
Is more of a making disciples.
Okay. So then what's a disciple? Disciple making movement.
I was hoping you would tell me.
Oh, well, a disciple is a follower of, a disciple is not necessarily a follower of Jesus. I think you could be a disciple of
Blacksmith.
A blacksmith. That's more of an apprentice, I guess. But disciple in the way we're talking about it is a follower of Jesus, not a convert,
right?
But a follower of Jesus. Because you could say the sinner's prayer, but not follow Jesus.
Right.
And if you look at the disciples in the Bible, they were living with Jesus. They were walking with him. They were listening to him. They were talking to him. They were doing life with Jesus. And that's a disciple.
So as someone, I didn't grow up in the church, but you did.
Yes.
And so as someone who grew up in the church, because I can't really appreciate this, tell me why that's a foreign concept for people like you. Like people like you who grew up in the church. Like when you were growing up and someone said, what's a disciple? You probably would have given a similar answer. Oh, it's a follower of Jesus or someone who's a Christian.
Yeah.
But how would you suggest that the typical American understanding of being a disciple is deficient or shallow?
Is someone who goes to church. That would be a disciple.
Yeah.
And then participates in Christian culture. So they go to Christian concerts. In the 90s, it was like you wore the Christian T-shirts.
WWJD.
Yeah, you had the WWJD. You went to Christian summer camp. You participated in Christian culture. And it was more about just kind of doing the right thing. Like this is what Christians do.
I'm waiting to get married before I have sex, stuff like that.
Yeah, which are good things.
Yeah.
But it was more of like, this is what Christians do. This is what our culture does. Not let me study Jesus and his teachings and, spend time in prayer and abiding. And this is how I'm going to react to it.
Well, that's an interesting observation because you can get some of Christ-likeness by following a culture, but you can't get all of it because then, if I'm a disciple of Christ, I need to be able to hear his voice so I can follow it. If he gives me instructions, he says, if I'm playing follow the leader, I need to know where he's going, when he's going, how he's going. And if I'm following a culture, there might be aspects of that culture which are accurately following Christ, but then there's all these other aspects of the culture which aren't synonymous with following Christ. And I think for me, going back to our intro question, one of the things that I really was struck by when I went overseas for the first time in college for those 8 weeks was, and I was a relatively new believer. I'd been a believer for like a year or a little bit less than a year. But so much of my faith, I realized it was like, so much of my faith was culturally embedded in what it means to be a Christian just because I was an American. And I had these presuppositions and these assumptions about what it meant to be a follower of Christ just because I grew up in a country that understood this idea of Christianity and God. And so when I think about being a disciple and I came to faith and I came back from overseas and I was reading the Word of God, and I knew that Jesus had given these clear commands to people, like the Great Commission, go and make disciples of all nations, and, that Jesus wanted stuff of us. And so I think that for me, in those early years, I viewed discipleship as just like make sure you obey Jesus instead of, that's part of discipleship, but discipleship is also more than that. It's also the way of Christ and not just making sure you check all the boxes.
Yeah.
And so there was some of that sense of like following the rhythm of the world, the pattern of the world, checking the boxes. I just started doing that in the Christian world.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And like, well, just give me a list. What do I need to do? Check, 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 check.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That kind of idea.
Well, and I would say that Jesus' disciples were his companions. They were his partners. They were his friends.
Yeah.
It talks about John being the disciple that Jesus loved the most. Like,
Right.
there was definitely a relationship in there. It wasn't like they were obeying him out of like if I was going to like hang out with the president all day and be like, I'm just going to be on my best behavior because I'm with the president.
Right. That's not discipleship.
Yeah, but it was like, hey, I honor this guy. He's a rabbi, but he's also my friend, but he's also my leader. He's also my shepherd.
Yeah.
There was definitely a loving relationship.
I read this quote the other day and I shared it with Gina, so I have a screenshot of it. And I'm going to change a little bit. He has spiritual formation. I'm going to put discipleship.
Okay.
You could argue that the essence of the disciples' journey is learning how to hear and respond to the voice and initiative of God. And I think that idea of the essence of discipleship is learning to hear and respond to the voice and the initiation of God in my life. That if you just give me a list of things to obey, I'm scratching at the surface of discipleship. But true discipleship is I have this healthy relationship with Jesus. I hear his voice through his spirit and prayer and the word as I fast, as I seek solitude and silence. And from that place, I know what he wants me to do, and I'm going to do it because I'm trying to walk in his ways. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. What I love about the Czech Republic trip that you reference is you went with Gina.
I did.
Who was not quite your girlfriend yet.
No, she didn't know. She didn't know I was sneaking up on her.
And I don't know. I feel like the way I've heard the story being told,
everybody knew,
was like Gina and Billy, they're going to, become a thing. And Gina was like, I can't wait to spend the rest of the summer with Billy. And Billy's like, Gina, I'm staying in the Czech Republic.
I got to get some
for 6 more weeks.
Disciples made.
I love it. You were just like,
get her done.
Yeah. Yep. So, but you still got Gina to fall in love with you.
Yep.
So
20 years.
Good. Yep. 20 years ago, old Billy and Gina trying to get together, and Billy's like, nope, I'm making disciples.
Well, so here's the thing, guys. In the coming, over the next few weeks, sessions, whatever you want to say, we're going to be talking about these things. But what we really want to push on is how healthy disciples.
Did you just dodge my question?
It was no question. You just basically were like, "Oh, you and Gina Bill just want to make disciples."
All right. Well, I guess that's why they call you Business Billy.
It was a little more complicated than that. Love is a complicated thing, David. You know what I mean?
So.
Right. What?
So this is what sets us apart.
What do you want to know?
Sets us apart.
What do you want to know?
I don't know anything. Oh, I already know. What
do you want the people to know?
I want them to know why we want to talk about multiplication and not addition.
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons this whole topic of disciple making is so hard for us to wrap our brain around it is because as Americans, what we are used to is what you said. It's like invite someone to church or street evangelism or somebody giving you like a video to watch or a podcast to listen to or a book to read or a track to read or something like that.
But even,
just
to even add on to that, even a big, huge outreach like a Billy Graham or a Harvest Crusade, that's still addition. Right,
because all of those are basically having, it's plus one, plus one, plus one, plus one. Might be plus 1,000, but it's plus one. So, for example, and I didn't invent this illustration, but it's just a really good picture of what we're talking about. If you think of it this way, you can have, if you plan a 10,000 person church every year for the rest of your life.
That sounds like a lot of work.
It sounds like a lot of work. It sounds like a lot of money. It sounds like a lot of training, a lot of bandwidth, all that kind of stuff, versus I lead, I lead and disciple a couple people, 3 people, 2 people even. And by the end of the year, those 2 people are leading 2 other people to Christ and discipling them, and so on and so forth. For the first 5 years, the small group approach is really unimpressive. But within, I think it's within 10 years, it outpaces the mega church of 10,000 every year, because one is multiplication and it's exponential growth, whereas the other one is just 10,000 plus 10,000 plus 10,000. Or to put it another way, you have elephants have a gestation period, I think of 18 months or something like that.
Almost 2 years.
Yeah, almost 2 years before they can have a baby. And yeah, they're big and there's a lot of meat, but if you start off with a handful of rabbits over those same 2 years or 5 years, I think it's over 5 years, it's over 1 billion rabbits or something insane. I mean, they can literally get pregnant when they're 20 days old, you know what I mean? Or whatever the number is. So one is multiplication and one is just adding one, adding one. And so even all of our stuff that we do in the United States is mostly based upon adding as opposed to multiplication, because multiplication is about empowering someone else to do it. Why don't we talk about, why do you think it matters? Okay, shouldn't we just be happy when anybody comes to faith?
Yeah.
And then we'll go into some scripture following up.
We should be happy. But I just heard this. Did you read that? Did you get that YouTube short with that guy?
No.
There's this Asian guy, and he's got funny hair and cool glasses, and he always gives these public speaking tips.
Okay.
And one of his public speaking tips is when someone says something, and to respond, you don't say but.
Ooh.
You say and, because it puts it in a negative or a positive space. So ask me the question about...
David, if you think I remember the question, you are sadly
The question
mistaken.
was about, do we get excited about one...
Should we get excited about
one
anything?
convert?
Well, shouldn't we get excited about anything? Or
Yeah. Well, I could say, but what Jesus said is to go into all the world. But the way I'm going to say it is, that's great. And Jesus said, go into all the world.
Yeah.
So we think about, as the church, we are to go into all the world to make disciples, to preach the gospel. If we are going to go into the world, addition is going to take a lot longer than multiplication.
Yes.
Exponential growth. Even if you had, a bunch of Billy Grahams and a bunch of Greg Laurie's and all of these mega church models, and it's if you look at the math of it, multiplication is the way we're going to reach the world, and it's what Jesus modeled.
Well, I was going to say,
it's like Jesus modeled. He pour into 12 guys.
And I'm not Billy Graham, and you're not Billy Graham.
No.
And yes, praise the Lord for men and women who are gifted like that, who can
course.
Influence millions of people.
Of course.
But what about the rest of us?
Yeah.
What's disciple making look like for the other guys?
Yeah, for just Joe.
Just regular people.
Joe works at
Home Depot.
Yep.
All right, so why don't we take a pause, and then we'll come back and we'll look at 2 Timothy.
Oh, we are back, and we are here to talk about 2 Timothy 2, 1 through 2.
Yeah. I think that I think one of the things you said at the end there was this is what Jesus did, that Jesus invested in 12 guys. And I think that sometimes we forget that the Bible actually has a lot to say, not just about the command to make disciples, but it has a lot to say about how to make disciples.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we're going to look at 2 Timothy 2, chapter 2, verses 1 through 2.
Oh, you want me to read it?
I'll read it. Then, I already messed it up. You then, my child, be strengthened by the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And what you, Timothy, have heard from me, Paul, in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. So this is Paul talking to his disciple, Timothy.
At the end of his life, right? So I think what we want you to see from this is that these verses, just these 2 verses, this is a picture of not only multiplication, but it's also a picture of how Paul did ministry. Addition would say, hey, you, Timothy, get the guys who you're investing in and bring them over to me
Yeah.
so I can teach
I'm
them.
about ready to die.
Because I'm going to die.
I need to get some good words into them.
I need to get, well, the getting is ready.
Yep.
Okay. And so that would be addition. But what he says to him is he says, what you heard from me, pass on to others, who will pass it on to others, who will pass it on to others. And so Paul is like divorced from that process, but he's still influential over it because of his relationship with Timothy. And I think that's the difference between addition and multiplication. Multiplication is really about empowering other people.
Yeah. Well, and what you see here, if we look at the multiplicative, I always have a hard
No,
time.
you did it. You nailed it. Multiplicative.
Multiplicative generations here. So you have Paul, which is one, talking to Timothy
In the
which is
presence.
two,
In the presence.
in the presence of many witnesses. So I
Yeah.
think that's cool. It wasn't Paul. Like I think people often think it was just Paul and Timothy hanging out.
Right.
It was Paul and Timothy in the presence of witnesses. So there was other guys there. You're going to entrust to faithful men, and we'll talk about that more in the future. The idea of like who are the people that you should be pouring into?
Right.
Faithful men who are able to teach others also.
Right.
So you got like 5 generations there.
It's really pretty remarkable when you actually think about it, that you have this picture of the gospel spreading from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. And if you think about it this way, this is what we need overseas, because when you're talking about 29% of the world being Muslim and an enormous number, like 2 billion people who have limited or no access to the gospel, if your methodologies is save one, and then after 20 years of pouring into him, when he finally has his MDiv, to have him go back and introduce somebody else to Christ, you're going to lose a nation. Like you can't maintain with population growth.
Yeah.
It's just a ridiculous thing. So this is how the early church spread so rapidly, you know? So let me ask you a question.
Okay.
When you think about what Paul just described, and we talked about it a little bit, so maybe there isn't a whole lot to talk about, but how is that different from almost everyone's experience with Christianity and how to make disciples and missions and all that kind of stuff?
It's a come and see mentality, or I guess mentality. Yeah.
Yeah.
This idea of come and see. You have this professional. You have the guy who's the great speaker, or you have the great program.
Yeah,
the
VBS.
great concert. Yeah. You have a program, and you bring them in. And then, it's an invitation. It's attraction. It's who's got the coolest drum set and the coolest band.
Right.
Bring them in,
And God uses that. We're not saying that that's evil or something like that.
Yeah, that's really something we have to lean into, is because we're not bashing that, and it's going to sound like we are, but what we're saying is that there's another way.
If your goal is movement,
Yes.
if your goal is just, I want to reach somebody, okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
But if your goal is movement, you can't just do a VBS in Kenya once every 3 years and expect you're going to come back one year and there's going to be 100 churches planted, because they're just going to look forward to your VBS.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
But if you were doing a VBS, and at the same time as that VBS, you were training 3 or 4 leaders on disciple-making processes, then that VBS will probably continue to go, and you would also see those things spread throughout. So,
but if that's going to happen, so yes, you need this multiplicative process, right? Paul's describing this multiplicative process, 1 to 3 to 9, so on and so forth. So you do need a multiplicative process, but the problem is, and it goes back to what you said about the 10,000 person megachurch.
Yeah.
That sounds really expensive. It sounds really cumbersome. Complicated. It requires people with degrees, because if you have that many people, you're probably rocking a staff of 50 people. That means you literally need an HR department.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You need a CFO, all this kind of stuff.
You have a comptroller. I don't even know what that is.
I know. You probably got a gaffer.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Running the
gaffer.
lighting. You know what I mean? And so you think about all those things and you realize this is really complex and this is really simple.
Yeah.
What Paul's describing sounds really simple, and it's simple things are going to multiply a lot faster than complex things. It's not that complex things can't multiply, but they don't multiply nearly as readily.
Yeah. So what we are going to talk about in the hub this podcast
The hub.
are simple, biblical, reproducible processes. Simple, biblical, reproducible. So simple, we want it to be this could work here in Cape May. It could work in Leipzig, Germany. It could work in Faisalabad, Pakistan.
Kazakhstan, too.
Kazakhstan.
Could it?
You know this is a disciple-making podcast because we have a map behind us and a cross here.
David.
And hardwood paneling.
Can I ask you a question?
What?
Could it work in Namibia?
Namibia? I could see that working.
Could it work in Mali?
Yeah, I think it could.
Alaska? The point, guys, is that everything we're going to talk with you about, none of it is going to be specifically... we're going to give you examples, of course, of what this looks like in the United States and what it might look like somewhere else. But the idea is that the principles that we want to share, we have over the last 6, 7, 8 years, we have tried so hard to take what we've learned, what we've trained in, what we've experienced, all of our mistakes, and kind of boil them down to principles that transcend culture. You know, and so that the idea is you can't say, well, that's irrelevant to me because I live in the deep South. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You know, because these things transcend culture, and you should be able to take these principles, like, for example, teaching people to self-feed, you know, knowing how to read the word for themselves, teaching people to self-feed. That transcends culture. It doesn't matter where you are in the world or in the United States. If you're going to make disciples, you need to teach your disciples to know how to self-feed so they're not reliant on somebody to give them information all the time, that kind of idea. So those transcend. And so these simple, biblical, reproducible processes, they transcend culture, which kind of greases the tracks for multiplication.
Yep. All right, so we're just going to take let's take a quick break, kind of process all that, what that meant, you know, what that means to be, you know, simple versus complex. And then we're going to look at this idea of healthy, faithful people. That's who Paul told Timothy to look out for. So let's take a quick break, and then we'll lean into that when we get back. Well, welcome back. We hope you're enjoying this podcast. Definitely leave us a comment. Let us know, you know, what you think. If you have any questions, concerns,
Mailbag it.
critiques, we want to hear from you. This is, you know, when we were praying through this before recording, we want this to be a tool, and we're just trying to take the experience that we have and share it with others. So we hope this is working out well for you. So, but let's get back to 2 Timothy chapter 2. Paul tells Timothy to look for, he says, in the presence of faithful men.
Yeah, entrust to faithful men.
To faithful men. So should that mean I'm only discipling, like I'm handpicking who I'm discipling, or what can you say about that, Billy?
Well, you know, I think it's really hard to figure out if someone is actually going to do anything with whatever you teach them. You know what I mean? But I think the idea is not every form of multiplication is good multiplication. You know, as one guy said before, that cancer is a form of multiplication. COVID is a form of multiplication. And so the goal isn't to infect the world. The goal is to spread the gospel around the world. And so you think about it this way, there's a bunch of heretical prosperity gospel teachings throughout Africa that have multiplied out of the heretical prosperity teachings in the United States.
Yeah.
So just because something multiplies rapidly doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah.
You know, but what we want is to have healthy multiplication. And I think that idea of, that's why he says, entrust it. Like, that's a big word.
Yeah.
Like when the day comes when my daughters get married, I'm entrusting them to this man that he's going to take care of them. He's going to provide for them. And like under penalty of having their father-in-law punch him in the head. You know
Corey
what I mean?
better get a job.
You better get 2 jobs, depending on which daughter. You know what I mean? And so you have this idea of you need to be faithful. I'm entrusting something of incredible value. And so I think we need to be people who are healthy people. Like, if you aren't at first pursuing health on your own, I don't think you should be so worried about starting a movement. I think you need to be growing so that you can be a healthy person.
Yeah. I think that's a really good thing to look at is, are you a faithful person? Like, before you start
worrying
trying to
about
make
if that
disciples.
guy's faithful.
Yeah. So what does that look like? What would a faithful person look like in your own life, or even with someone that you're looking for?
Well, I think a faithful person, maybe we can just ping pong a little bit, but I think a faithful person follows through on what they say they're going to do.
A faithful person, I think they're wanting to grow. They're like seeking, they may not know what it looks like. I don't think, we got to remember that a faithful person hasn't already arrived, quote unquote. They're not like, oh, this person's, perfect or whatever.
Right.
They may still have, some rough edges,
Well,
but they're hungry and they want to grow. Grow closer to Jesus.
Yeah, I was going to say, think of it like marriage. I'm a faithful husband. That doesn't mean I'm a perfect husband.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
You know what I mean?
Illustration.
But theoretically, after 20 years of marriage, I'm a better husband today than I was 19 years ago.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I faithful doesn't mean perfect, but it does mean my heart has a soul affection. Like I'm not. So if you're a faithful person is someone who loves Jesus, and they're not, always torn between the stuff of the world and the stuff of faith.
Yeah.
Obviously those things grow, but those are some other things that come to my mind.
Yeah. And I think so we think about that, and then we think about entrusting this message or this task to someone. If you're going to disciple someone, this is another thing that's different from, discipleship is different from just evangelism or preaching. Discipleship is time consuming.
Yeah.
It is all encompassing. Jesus lived with the disciples. Paul and Timothy and his disciples, they lived together, they traveled together. So not to say that we have to start a commune if you're doing discipleship, but discipleship is more than just like once a week Bible study.
Yeah, but that being said, I think that's one of the reasons why college ministries have a lot of success.
Yeah.
Is because they do live together.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So when I became a follower of Christ, I was in college. There was an InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. We ate lunches together. We ate dinners together. We hung out. Like our door where John and I lived was open, and people would just stop in all day long.
Yeah.
And it was totally normal to have 20 people in there watching a movie, or like 5 people playing Halo while 10 people are just hanging out watching, and these kinds of ideas.
Yeah.
So,
but what I was going to say was the discipleship is going to take up a lot of time. It's going to take up a lot of bandwidth as someone who's making a disciple. You want to make sure they're faithful, because you don't want to be, and this is going to sound really harsh, and I hope everyone gets what I'm saying. You don't want to waste your time on some guy who's a dud, who has no desire to grow. If I'm going to give you 10 hours a week or 15 hours a week of my time, I want to make sure it's a faithful man that's going to be willing and wanting to then pour into others.
Yeah, Paul doesn't say, hey, Timothy, just grab like a couple of dudes who are down for a free lunch.
Yeah.
If there's these guys who will show up if you pay for their hotel, bring them. That's not what he says.
Yeah.
He says faithful men who will be able to teach other people. Yeah. And so they're not just going to learn, but they're going to pass it on.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a big culture shift for the United States, because we have a culture of learn. I don't have to pass it on. I don't have to do anything. Like, we don't feel this urgency that I'm supposed to actually implement. I heard something last week. I forget what it was, but he was talking about how American Christians are so good at talking about things that they know nothing about.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That we just we can read something and then we can reproduce it, but we've never actually implemented the things that we teach on.
Yeah. So I would say that's actually a really good segue into this next section. So if you look at verse 1, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "You then, my child, be strengthened by the grace that is in Christ Jesus." And I think what early on in our disciple making journey, we were a lot more about the processes of what it looks like to entrust to men and to teach this well. But we really have to remember that we are strengthened by the grace that is in Christ Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that idea of realizing that at the end of the day, disciple making is spiritual work.
Yep. Yeah.
It's in other words, God is always the great initiator.
Yeah.
He initiated creation. He initiated the gospel. He initiated the promise and the covenant. He initiated Christ. He initiated the cross. He initiated the resurrection. He initiated our rebirth. And if you think about that idea, it's really silly for me to think if I can just get my little flow chart nailed down perfectly, then God's just going to move. Like, God's going to move because God wants to move. But he does want to move.
Yeah.
Right? And I think often what happens is we get in the way because we kind of like slow it down. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I mean, a good example of this is that you might have a situation where God starts really moving in this ministry or in such and such church or whatever it might be, but then there might be nothing internally that's like raising up new leaders or unleashing responsibility. And so then the Spirit of God almost gets like choked out because it can't move forward.
Yeah.
You know, kind of like it says in the parable of the sowers and how that third soil gets choked out by the weeds and the distractions and the riches of life. So David, you used to own a sailboat.
I did. I did used to own a sailboat.
Now, I know that your little sailboat had like a little 5 horsepower putt-putt on the back so you could dock, right? Or something like that.
I had a...
Was it 15?
15 horse Yanmar diesel engine.
Wow. Well,
There was no putt-putting, baby. It was...
Sure sounded like a putt-putt to
6
me.
knots of power.
Okay, 6
It
knots.
was...
Okay. So, but let's talk old school sailboats.
Okay.
No diesel power.
No diesel power.
So tell me, as an experienced sailor, what do you need, generally speaking?
Wow.
I need a boat.
You need a boat.
Some water. What else do I
You
need?
need a boat and water. You're going to need, if you're a sailor, you're going to need sails.
Sails.
And you're going to need...
I can make them out of like a bed sheet.
You're going to need good, healthy sails. No holes in them.
Okay.
No dry rot. They need to be...
What causes dry rot?
too much sun. Not enough... protection out of the sun. So if you leave them in the sun, they're going to dry rot. If you want to, package them up when you're not using them, put them in a case.
Okay.
In a bag.
Be responsible here.
Be responsible. Yep. And you're going to want good rigging. It's going to hold up the sail.
Okay. Rope, you mean?
Good. Yeah, rope for you land lubbers.
For us land lubbers. Rope. He's talking about, guys.
So you want good rigging. Yep. A good healthy mast. It's not going to break on you.
Yep.
You want to make sure that's all your deck fittings are not rusting.
Yep.
You want to make sure that's all good. And then lastly, once you get that all in place, you got to go out on the water and get some wind.
So what if it's zero wind? I mean, I know that if it's like the wind's not on the right.
Did you ever see Tommy Boy when he's sitting on the lake? Could use a little wind here.
Just give me a little wind. I mean, I know that if the wind is blowing in the wrong direction, what do they call it? Tacking?
Yeah.
You can like tack and you can kind of like move a little bit.
Yeah.
But if there's no wind.
So have you ever heard of someone when they say they're in the doldrums? You ever heard that saying?
I feel like I'm in the doldrums right now on this podcast.
Yeah. That's what that is. When there's no wind.
That's what I didn't know that.
It's called the doldrums. So if you're, sailing across the Atlantic in the summertime and there'll be the doldrums will go for like 2 weeks. No wind. And then you just sit there.
I bet the bugs are so bad.
I don't know. I don't know if bugs go out in the middle of the ocean.
Caleb used to tell me that. Caleb's one of our friends. He used to say the bugs would be so bad on the boat.
Yeah.
Of course, they could land on the boat.
Yeah. So, I don't know about the bugs, but the boredom, and the fear of running out of water.
The doldrums.
Scurvy.
That's why I always bring some oranges.
But yeah, so you need a healthy boat, you need healthy rigging, you need healthy tools, you need a good healthy crew.
Yeah.
But then you also need wind.
So this is why we bring that up. We want you to think about all the stuff we're talking about. We want you to think of it as like, this is the boat. This is the mast. This is the sail. This is the rigging. You have the sailors, okay? But the bottom line is, unless the Spirit of God blows, that wind, that Spirit of God, wind, it doesn't matter. And so, in other words, this isn't like a formula. Like, you do these 7 things, and there you go. It doesn't work that way. Yeah. God's not a genie. He's not a pagan God where you put in the quarter and you pull the switch.
Yeah.
No, but these things are important to see movement continue. The Spirit's going to do whatever the Spirit wants to do. Mm-hmm. But the difference between addition and multiplication is the presence of these factors as well as the Spirit of God. Most importantly, the Spirit of God. Yeah. But we want to be ready so that when the Spirit of God starts blowing, we are actually ready to collaborate with Him rather than quenching Him or getting in the way.
Yep, we'll pull that sail up and just catch that wind.
Go, baby.
Yep. So we hope that you have enjoyed this podcast. We are going to land that plane. Billy, what are we going to look forward to? What do we got coming up next?
So in the coming sessions, I mean, you think about what we just unpacked. We unpacked the fact that if you want to see multiplication, you need the power of God working through faithful people using a multiplicative process.
Yep.
Okay? The power of God working through faithful people using a multiplicative process. And so that idea of the power, the people, and the process, those are the things that we're going to unpack over the coming sessions. And we want you to learn from all of our mistakes, because for 6 and 7 years, 8 years, we've been trying to figure this out, implement it in the United States, learning from overseas, implementing in the United States, training overseas, learning from other practitioners. And we want you to kind of stand on our shoulders so you can get ahead of the game and not reproduce all the things that we did wrong in the beginning. So we're going to unpack those different things, these ideas, these sales that are present in every movement on the face of the planet. You know, there's not a movement alive where people aren't praying, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And we're going to teach you about that, show you about that, answer any questions that come up, because we want you to succeed. We want you to make disciples here in the United States or overseas or wherever you live. And we want to see you succeed in that effort. And so that's what we're going to be doing.
Yep. So,
sorry, my phone. It's the president.
Whoa. Better answer it.
Nah.
No. Nope. All right. Well, we thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope you tune in again.
And if you have any
questions,
send to the mailbag.
You're really leaning into this.
Hashtag mailbag.
You
I don't know. Mailbox.
You're really leaning into this mailbag thing.
Just give it to Kevin Costner, because he was in that Postman thing, and he'll bring it to us. Is that better? Just if you have a question, just leave a comment.
Just leave it.
David is making this all complicated. Sign it out, guys.
Thanks a lot.
If we come back.
Bye-bye.